Hey everybody, welcome to the stream. Thanks for joining. Could I get a thumbs up if you can hear my voice? Morning. All right, Dirk is saying morning, so I'll take that as a you can hear me. Cool. Um, so wonderful. Great to have you here. Um, Thanks for joining today. Yeah, I thought I would just do a live stream and kind of go through some questions about elm-pages. And we've got some great questions here. So let me dig into those. How's everybody doing today? How's everybody holding up with the lockdown, the self-quarantining, getting some time to do some Elm projects? Everybody staying safe out there? Been a kind of an odd time for everybody. Yeah, more time to learn Elm, definitely. It's a good time to dig in and pick up a hobby. Okay, so cool. Let's dig into some of these questions. So we've got an anonymous question. Sorry if this is not a great question. Still feel new to Elm and just saw elm-pages. Can you add syntax highlighting to code examples like Jekyll can? So yeah, this is a great question. Sometimes questions from a beginner's perspective highlight some really great stuff. So, and by the way, you can add more questions as I'm going through these. So feel free, slido.com, and then it's just, you just type in the code elm-pages. So let's see. Can you add syntax highlighting? Absolutely, you can. And the elm-pages starter has some syntax highlighting. Let's see, does the blog post have an example? Yeah. So here's some syntax highlighting. So there are actually a few different ways to do syntax highlighting with elm-pages, and elm-pages sort of puts it in your hands to figure out how you'd like to do that. So the way that this is being rendered is, so let me pull up this elm-pages starter repo. And if we go to the main.elm, we've got, so here's our main entry point. So this is the entry point. Bigger font. Thank you. Let me know if there's anything else that could make it easier to read. So this is our sort of main entry point. Let me git stash my work here. So yeah, so this is kind of the equivalent of, if you do a browser.sandbox or application, this is the equivalent entry point of our main entry point for elm-pages. And so in that, we define this documents. And what documents do, so here's the document we have. So it's taking any files in the content folder with the extension markdown, .md extension. It's using our metadata decoder to parse the front matter. So this is front matter. It's just stuff in the content folder files that's between these triple hyphens. And this is just JSON. You can do YAML, and it just parses them all into JSON, so you can use a JSON decoder in your Elm code. So we have a JSON decoder here. Metadata.decoder is just a JSON decoder that we've defined. So this is our custom decoder. You could do anything you want. You could decode into any type you want. And then we have this function that we pass in. So we say, given the body, here's how I want to parse it. And so we're just using the markdown.toHTML function. So this is from the Elm Explorations Markdown, just a tiny bit bigger, please, on the font. Thanks for letting me know. So yeah, we've got, we're using the Elm Explorations Markdown parser, and it's just rendering the Markdown body here. And now the Elm Explorations Markdown parser it actually uses Highlight.js. So this package relies on the Highlight.js project. So what you do is you have window.hl.js. So you need to have that global variable. It's a little bit unusual for an Elm package, but because this is in the Elm Explorations repo space, it's able to have some native code. So the Elm Explorations Markdown parser actually uses some native JavaScript, and it actually wraps this JavaScript Markdown parser called marked.js, I think, and then it will take your code blocks and it will call the Highlight.js syntax highlighter on that. And so in this starter repo, what we have is in our entry point file, index.js, all we're doing is exposing HL.js in the global scope, just like it says in the documentation here. So if I were to, let me run this locally. If I were to, so you can git clone the elm-pages starter. We can go to this locally. We can go to this blog post, which has some highlighted text. And I can break this if I, just to prove that it's actually using this HL.js. If I refresh the page, did I cause an error? HL.js is not defined. All right, it's more, okay. It's more forgiving about, it's telling me about more errors than I expected it to. Okay, so there I've successfully broken my syntax highlighting because the Elm Explorations Markdown parser expects this to be in the global scope. So now it's not doing syntax highlighting. So that's one way to do syntax highlighting. But as you might imagine from what I was showing you here, this kind of gives us complete control over what we want to do with parsing our markdown. And of course, it doesn't have to be markdown. We're looking for things with the .md extension, but we could do whatever we want. All we need to do, so if we look at this type, the type document handler, we just need this to be a document handler, which means it's got, so like this function here, pages.document.parser, it takes a record with telling you the extension. So it's going to find all the files with that extension. It takes a Json decoder that's going to decode into your metadata type for your elm-pages data. And then it takes a function that takes a string and returns a result of your view type. So you could do anything you could imagine doing with a string. You could have a hard-coded thing. You could have your own custom thing. You could define a parser. You could parse, I don't know, whatever format you could imagine, ASCII doc, or you could parse some sort of data format. So it's completely in your hands. So if we wanted to do syntax highlighting in a different way, we could do that. So another way to do syntax highlighting in Elm-pages, in the Elm-pages docs site, so I actually changed the way that this works in the Elm-pages docs site. It used to be using a web component, which you can absolutely do. If I go to the Elm-pages docs site lives in the examples folder in the in the core elm-pages repo. So let's see here. So if I go into, so this is the elm-pages GitHub repository. If I go into the examples folder and then the docs folder, the examples docs is elm-pages.com. And it looks like I removed my web components for the syntax highlighting because I'm no longer using it. But that's another way you can do it. I'll pull that out of the Git history and share a link to that after, because that's a pretty handy technique. You can do anything you can imagine with JavaScript and just render an Elm, an HTML node in Elm, and it will run that sort of self-contained JavaScript within that HTML node in your Elm. But from your Elm code, it's sort of, you're declaratively calling, you're declaratively just rendering this element, and then some JavaScript happens under the hood, but from the point of view of your Elm code, it's very declarative. So, so the way I'm doing the syntax highlighting right now is I'm using Pablo Hirafuji's syntax highlight package. And this is quite cool because it's a pure Elm solution to syntax highlighting. So now the elmpages.com documentation site and blog has pure, it's rendering this as pure HTML with no JavaScript, as a pure Elm function that's allowing it to render that. So, which means if I had JavaScript turned off, it would also be able to render this correctly, which is nice. Yeah, it's a custom. So it's not currently a custom element, but it used to be. So I'll, in fact, let me go through the Git history a little bit here and see if I can find that real quick. Yeah. Okay, so if I go to the elm-pages repo, let me explore it at a particular commit. So view file at this commit. So I want to explore the repo and I want to find code editor. Oh, I actually need to go one before this. I need to go to the commit before this. Okay. So now if I find code editor, here it is. Okay, so here's the link. I'll share it in the chat. And so we're defining a custom element. I actually, Luke Westby's web component talk at Elm Europe a couple of years back is a really nice resource. I recommend it if you're curious about how to use web components in your Elm code. It's just a great technique. You don't have to use ports for it. You can have this self-contained component that describes some JavaScript stuff. I'm curious, why change so we only serve HTML instead of running JS for the highlight? Yeah, I mean, for one thing, it's nice to be able to think about the code as pure Elm and not think about the web components. The web components worked perfectly fine. Partially, it was just an experiment that I wanted to see how it felt to use the pure Elm version. But also just, in principle, there's no reason why syntax highlighting needs to include like a JavaScript web component. It's just sort of breaking down your code into different tokens and then adding some like CSS classes or some HTML markup to indicate that, so you can highlight it correctly. So it's just, I just like the simplicity of that. And also the pre-rendered content is not dependent on JS, whereas when you use web components, it is. Now, that said, I would not shy away from using it if the best solution to your problem, or if the functionality that you want to add is easily added using web components, I'd say go for it. It's supported in, I don't know if IE11 supports it, but all the major browsers have decent support for the core web component functionality at this point. I'm actually using web components. This is like a whole other topic here, but the localized dates here are using web components on the Incremental Elm live site. So in a nutshell, the reason I'm using web components to render the localized date strings here is because the Elm time package does not, so there are sort of two notions of a time zone. Right now, I live on the West Coast, so I'm in Pacific time. But, it's, we're during the daylight time window, so I'm actually in Pacific daylight time. So Pacific time is sort of like a time zone independent of time of year. And Pacific Daylight Time is a time zone offset. So it's like, GMT -8 maybe. And then Pacific Standard Time is GMT -9, I think. So anyway, the current Elm time API, if you try to display a time, you can get the user's time zone. You can display it in the user's time zone, but it's showing it in the user's time offset. So if the time crosses time boundaries into, this actually happened when I was first building this page. I was showing an event that was after the time switch from standard to daylight time, the daylight saving switch. And so it was showing it with my current offset, not with the offset that Pacific time would have. So it was showing it off by 1 hour, the event. And so I just didn't want to think about any of that. I just want to give a particular time and have it render it correctly in the user's time zone. So let me show you the code for that. It took me a while to kind of figure out what was going on, what the problem was, the possible ways to solve the problem, possible like web platform APIs I could use to solve that nicely. But once I did, I'm really happy with this solution. Maybe I should write a blog post on it. But if I go to the Incremental Elm site, and don't follow my bad example of keeping the keeping the file name from Luke Westby's Elm Europe talk, which I used as a starting point for this stuff. I would recommend that you do a better job than me at trying to keep the name of the file to accurately match what's going on, which is it's not a code editor. It's this is really a file that I just kind of like to have one file that defines all of my custom elements. That's kind of what I've been doing, and it's been working pretty nicely. But here's how this custom element works. I have so I have this formatter. Oh, and just checking on the chat, time zones are insane. So we've got a link to an article in the chat about time zones and how complicated they are. Yeah, it's absolutely insane. Which is why it's also, if you're trying to fetch time zone data, there's this like giant database like IARC or something of like time zones. So if you just want to look up the name of a time zone and the offsets, like these things change over time too. They change with like regulations by, countries have different regulations for time zones. So a country for political reasons might decide to change when you go into daylight savings time, or might abolish daylight savings time for one country, and it's madness. So there's like a big database for looking up time zones. And so it makes sense to have that be built into the web platform. And so for performance reasons too, it's nice to just defer to the web platform for these things, which is why leveraging this web platform API, which is very well supported, is quite nice. So like here, let me just copy this formatter into the console here. And so let's see, how do we use this formatter? Formatter.format, and we can just say new date to get the current time. And so it's quite nice. Like if we were to use a different format here. So like if I said time zone name long, then it's going to spell out Pacific Daylight Time. So it's great. All I do is I render this Elm web component, international time. I have an attribute called whatever the attribute is called. I don't remember what is it. I hope it's not called editor value. I've done a bad job. See, sometimes I'm just afraid to like change JavaScript code, so I don't refactor it as much as I should. So then it just takes that value and it renders it in the user's local time. So like if I were to, let's see. It's under sensors, and it's kind of weird, but I can go to Berlin, and then instead of Monday's event being on Monday at 11 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time, now it's GMT +2 at 8 p.m. So anyway, it's quite cool. Web components are a super handy tool for that kind of stuff. So cool. So I think that was perhaps more detail than this person was looking for on that question, but hopefully that answers the question. Cool. All right, let's go on to the next one. And feel free to vote for these. Hopefully we'll have time for all of these questions. I think we probably will, but yeah, ask any questions you'd like. Okay, so what are good ways to let someone else update the content? E.g. the website owner or client, but not a developer. Nice. This is a great question. And this is kind of why I wanted to do this session in large part, because, there's like a lot of context that you don't know where to find these things out. So it's really nice. I mean, I've just spent so much time digging into these things, researching them, listening to podcasts and going through tutorials and reading GitHub issues on different static site generators and seeing how people are building things to just understand the landscape and to try to build this project and come up with a nice design. So I have a lot of like knowledge that I've picked up that like, if you're just trying to build like a nice marketing site for your company and you want somebody to be able to edit it, like you don't know all the landscape of solutions or even what to be looking for. So hopefully I can like share some of the context I've picked up from all my research on this area and save you some time. So what this question is kind of hitting at is one of the real strengths of this general set of tools in what's called the Jamstack. What I think of as the Jamstack is, it technically stands for, Jam is for JavaScript, APIs, and markup. But I think a better way to describe what the Jamstack is this sort of philosophy of piecing together the best tools instead of having a monolithic sort of service like, Drupal or WordPress, or having something like Jekyll where you just have your markdown content and you render that. You want to be able to use these nice services that have an API that maybe a marketing person might be able to use in a nice way. And then you want to be able to use whatever technical tools you want to build that. That's one of the core benefits of the Jamstack, is it's really good at letting the developers use whatever technical tools they want. It could be Gatsby, it could be it could be elm-pages, it could be Jekyll, it could be a number of different things, or Eleventy. But the technical people can choose their tools. The non-technical content-focused people can pick a service that works nicely for them. So there are a lot of these tools. If you search, here's a great resource for that. Is it called Headless CMS? Yeah, headlesscms.org. I'll share that link. So this is a really good resource. It's just listing out a bunch of options and some really popular options out there. So these are what are known as headless CMSs. And the general notion of a headless CMS is something like, you have a lot of CMSs out there like WordPress or like, what is it? Adobe, I can't remember. There's some like Adobe, but there are these very heavyweight solutions that try to do all of the technical stuff of like bundling your code and having a plugin ecosystem for it and everything. But headless CMSs just try to do one thing well, which is give you a nice interface for importing content. They try to allow you to give a structure to that content and say, what fields does your content have? What relationships does it have to other pieces of content? And then they try to expose a nice API for you to consume that content. So they're just focused on inputting content, structuring content, and allowing you to fetch content with whatever service you want to use, which is great because now you can piece together whatever service you would like. So if I want to build it with Gatsby or Eleventy or elm-pages, or if at some point something better comes along or something that better suits our problem, then you can switch over to it, but I can still keep using my headless CMS solution. So there are a lot of great ones. I'm actually using, so let me show you the Incremental Elm Live. Let me show you how I schedule an episode. So I'm using, for this, you can see the source code. I'll share a link. Here's the repository. The repository actually has this folder called Sanity, which is where I have this configuration for a headless CMS called sanity.io. And so I'll show you my dashboard. So if I go to this dashboard, you can see the live stream. So here's everything that's listed on incrementalelm.com/live. So if I wanted to schedule a new event, then this is what it looks like. So I don't know, what's an event? Test-driven Elm, or maybe like GitHub Actions with Elm. And then, this UI gives you all these things that you can. So this UI with sanity.io, it's completely configurable. It's pretty nifty. I can write in an episode description. GitHub Actions are a powerful free tool. great for an Elm open source project or for Elm applications. And I pick a date. Pick a time. In Pacific time, I can add a guest. So the guest, this is a relationship. So I've defined this relationship. So here are the guests that I've had in the past. I can pick a project. So maybe we're going to work on the Elm Graph QL open source repository and try to use GitHub Actions there. When I'm done, I can add the ID for the YouTube video. I can add some tags, and then I publish it. So now if we were to go to, let me run this locally. Okay, so now if I go to the Incremental Elm site on my local dev, here's the new event. So it's as easy as that. So you can see like a non-technical person could just, you know, if you have this URL, you could just, so this, I'm logged in here. So these types of tools have authentication and all that stuff you'd need, right? So if you just go in unauthenticated, you need to be somebody with privileges to be able to edit that content, and you can log in with different providers. So sanity.io is one solution that I've been playing around with. It's quite cool. And actually, I kind of saw one of the questions pop up in Slido a moment ago about Elm Graph QL, and sneak peek, sanity.io exposes a GraphQL endpoint, and this page is built using Elm Graph QL and elm-pages. So fun fact. So sanity.io is a cool one. Contentful is another one you can check out. There are just so many options. Contentful has a GraphQL API, but it is only for their like enterprise accounts, I think. Not for, so a lot of these services have really good free tiers. So I recommend just take a handful of them and play around with them. So Contentful, sanity.io is neat. And this is really, I mean, we could talk about the ins and outs of even one of these tools for an hour easily. But just start playing around with some of them. Look at some of the options on headlesscms.org. And then one last thing I'll mention on this topic is, so there are API-based CMS solutions and there are Git-based solutions. And both of these can work well for non-technical people to edit. You know, obviously, if you want technical people editing things, sometimes it's nice to have it in version control so people can make a pull request if they want to update some content. Maybe it's a documentation site like the elm-pages documentation site. So actually, with elm-pages, actually I think I have elm-pages set up with a headless CMS, a Git-based CMS tool called Netlify CMS. So here's a link to Netlify CMS. It's a Git-based tool. Let's see if we can even do an example. So I think if I go to elmpages.com/admin, I can log in with Netlify, and here's my dashboard. So I can actually create a new post. I can update the docs. So let's do that. Let's update the docs, and I don't know. I'll say core concepts. Static HTTP gives you a way to pull in data during the build step. This data is changes every time you run a build, you won't see a loading spinner or error with this data in your built production site. You might get a build error that you can fix. Okay, so this is the starting point for a core concepts page. Let's save it and see what happens. So this is a Git-based CMS. Oh, I just did this as rich text, which was an accident. I meant to be writing Markdown, so it just escaped this for me. Okay. So let's save this. Okay. Check for preview. Is that a thing? So now let's see. Did it make a pull request? Aha. So now if we go to the elm-pages repository, which is where the doc site lives, it's in the examples folder, it made a pull request. If we see the files changed, this is exactly what we edited. The title is core concepts. So you kind of teach it a little bit about like how to build this file based on these fields that you enter. Like I've got this title field. So the title field lives in this front matter title. And then documents in the documentation pages have type doc. That's just how I've done it with this page. You can get creative. You can solve this problem any way you like. And then here's the body of the content that we typed in. So now here's the super cool thing is it just made a pull request. And actually, do I not have this set to do a Netlify deploy preview? Why is it not doing a deploy preview? I'm not sure what's going on there. Usually pull requests to the elm-pages site will have a little Netlify deploy preview. And there it is. Aha. Cool. Yeah, so this is the really cool part is now, so this is in progress. It's Netlify is like checking a few things about the generated thing, but it's actually building the site, and it's gonna, when it's done, it's gonna give me this deploy preview. I guess I can click on it now. And we can see the build status. So it's building the site. It's, building my elm-pages build. Is it done? No, not yet. And when it's done, I'll be able to go to this deploy preview, and we can see this even though it's a pull request. So now this is like a feature of Netlify, which is quite cool, which is that actually Netlify has some things that I think are quite cool. Like as an Elm aficionado, we like immutability because we like to be able to kind of trace things back and, not think about side effects, but just think about like data. And Netlify has like a similar way of working to Git, where with Git, like a Git commit will always refer to one thing. It's like this immutable state. And Netlify uses the same type of thing where you can have a deploy and you can point to previous deploys, because Netlify is a host which it's like a CDN host. So it has this notion of edge. So if you haven't checked out Netlify, I highly recommend you check it out. It's a great hosting provider. They have a really nice free tier. So they have this notion of deploying to the edge, which means, so elm-pages and similar tools just generate static files. So you're not serving up the files with your own server. You just generate these static files, and then you host them through a CDN, which means you can host them super fast, and you can distribute those files all over the world because it's not like a single server that has a state. It's these stateless files that you just, show me blog/hello, and it just gives you that file or that set of files associated with that. So what that means is that we can link to a particular deploy, and since it's just a set of files, it just has this sort of snapshot in time for deploy, and we can look at that deploy and it's going to link to all the files for that point in time, which is quite cool. So our deploy preview is done. I stalled long enough. So if we go to the deploy preview, here it is. And this is actually pretty cool. So this deploy preview link is it's like a hash for that specific point in time. So the files on this page will not change if I update that pull request. Like if I went to my content manager and added something. But this one will. This deploy preview 91 will stay up to date with that pull request, which is pretty cool. So now if we go to blog and then, to docs, there's a new top level nav in our docs. So here's this core concepts tab and static HTTP, and it's got a little description of that. We've even got the table of contents, which is pretty nifty. So, yeah, that's a Git-based CMS. So I think, I guess I should probably pick up my pace for some of these questions a little bit, shouldn't I? But hopefully I may have answered some of these other questions as I was answering those first two. So, okay, cool. So Dirk's got a question. I'd like to understand more about how elm-pages works under the hood. Awesome. I would love to share some of that. So, okay, where to start? It's been really fascinating kind of trying to come up with creative solutions to how to, make the wiring work for elm-pages. So one of the most interesting things about elm-pages in terms of the internals is that, like, if we think about, let's go to like a main.elm, like for the documentation site. So this is in the elm-pages examples/docs folder in the elm-pages repo. If we go to the main entry point here, so we've got a few things, like we've got like a manifest, for example, which the manifest is like giving you a few things. Like if we go to elmpages.com, pull up the dev tools and look at application, here's the manifest. So you can see, like if we were to install this on a mobile device, you can, that doesn't look quite right, but you can see the icons, you can see the theme color, orientation, the short name and the long name if you were to install the app, for example. So that's this manifest. But the manifest is like a build time thing. So what it does is it generates this manifest.json file. That's just how that web standard works. So how does it take this, like what this is actually doing is, like a lot of frameworks would just have you build your own manifest.json file, and then it would, put the file in the right place and link to it in the appropriate places. But Elm-pages has it as pure Elm. So we have this pure Elm configuration for this manifest, and that results in having a file generated as part of your build. So how does it, so this Elm code is not just running at runtime in your browser. There's a build step, and I'm actually looking at this Elm code and generating a file based on the Elm code, right? So if you think about it, it's kind of weird. Like it's not just running this Elm app. Like this is an Elm-pages app. So Elm-pages is like running and managing the routing and stuff for this site right now. But it's also running at a build step. So how does that work? So the magic is that Elm-pages sneakily creates a CLI version of your app. So there's like a whole build step, which regular Elm apps don't have, where it will build, it will perform static HTTP requests. So like Yeah, so static HTTP requests, they're fetching things like this showcase page is fetching from Airtable, and so it fetches that all during a build step, right? So and elm-pages will actually like this is one of my favorite features, and it was definitely the hardest to build so far. It was really, really hard to build the internals of this, but as a user, it just kind of works, which is the beauty of it, is the framework can encapsulate these things for you. So you have this static HTTP request. So for this showcase page, I make a static HTTP request. It fetches something from the Airtable API. And also notice that like these secrets are masked, which I've talked about in previous live streams. So what it's doing there is it performs an HTTP request using the actual secrets at the build step, and then it takes the JSON data and it strips away anything that you didn't use in your Json decoder, so it optimizes that JSON asset to minify it. So it's guaranteed to decode into the same thing because you didn't touch any of those other fields that it strips away, but it's able to strip those out for you without changing the result. So anyway, so those are things that are happening at build time. So there's something different happening at build time than there is when the actual Elm-Pages app is running. So the Elm-Pages app has the CLI phase. So we can actually sneak in here. So let's go to, I'm putting it in the Elm stuff. Maybe I should put it somewhere else, but it's in Elm stuff. So I copy over these files and generate some files in the Elm stuff folder. And we've got a pages.elm. So Elm-Pages generates this pages.elm. So in the regular app, it's gen/pages.elm. So we generate, these nice things that you get, so you can say pages.articles. Exit gatekeepers, and that gives you a link to a URL that's like a known URL, which is handy. And this is in there's like a phase here, so it's running it in a different phase. Where does that live? Oh yeah. So the application type it's a Pages internal browser. So if I go into the same generated file, but the version that lives here, where is that? Yeah. The application type is pages.internal.cli. So it's actually running a different application runner, and it's running a headless app for this. And so in this phase, I've got this whole app that's like a CLI app. And what it does is it performs all of the static HTTP requests, which allows me to do some cool things like, for example, Elm-Pages, the static HTTP library allows you to do end then. So you can do an HTTP, so you could actually, without having any messages at all, you can do a paginated API request where you keep making API requests until there are no more items left. You can just store that as a single static HTTP request rather than having a follow-up message that you send and you keep sending the message until it's done, or chain tasks or something. You can just have that as a single static HTTP request. So anyway, the reason I'm able to have these different primitives is because I take this static HTTP type in the CLI process and I execute it for you. But then during the browser process, I'm able to do something else, which is I look up the responses and then I just run the decoder. So I'm actually not performing the HTTP request during the browser runtime. So that's one little bit of internals that's really powerful. Like, it opens up a lot of stuff, because like in elm-pages, if I wanted to expose some configuration where I say like, you can have different caching strategies with the service worker where you can cache images. Like, I could have a pure Elm configuration where you can say, okay, I could give you like an Elm function that says, I'll pass you like the file name of an image and some metadata, maybe. I don't know, maybe like the size of the image or the dimensions of the image, and you can tell me whether or not to cache it. And I could use that pure Elm configuration, and I could pull that in to JavaScript land and generate something in a service worker for you. Or I can use that in the configuration for the for my Webpack configuration. I could use some tool for that. So like, the sky's the limit. This is one of the most powerful like superpowers of Elm-pages, is that it has the ability to take your Elm functions and values that you pass in your main. So like this guy here, it can take all of these and it can use them during the CLI step and interact with JavaScript and with Webpack and all these things. So that's one of the coolest superpowers. Yeah, it's super powerful, super exciting. It just opens up so much stuff that you can do, but in a type-safe way and in a pure Elm way from the user's perspective. And then behind the scenes, I can use all these powerful JavaScript libraries, Webpack plugins, but I can expose it in a way where it's predictable and reliable, because I can have certain constraints on how you can use it. Like, and like this generate files hook is another example of this, right? So this generate files hook, I'm actually doing some, I'm actually working on some stuff that, like, there are so many cool things that this allows you to do. So this generate files hook, so this is just a function that you pass to your Elm-pages application. It's generate files. It gives you all of your routes and their front matter and the body of the files. And then you just generate a list. It's actually a list of results. And so you could, for some reason, say you could fail the build if something is wrong. But if everything's okay, then it just takes the paths that you give and the actual contents of the files, and you just generate files. So like, I've been working on like, you can generate like redirects files for your Netlify configuration. So you could redirect certain paths, and you could have that as metadata that you define in your front matter. And the sky's the limit, right? Because you've got a hook in your Elm code. You've got access to all of the metadata of your pages, and then you can just tell it to generate files. I'm also working on adding the ability to have access to static HTTP data here. So we could also, so one thing that I'm working on is I want to generate a calendar feed for the incremental Elm live events. So you could just get this iCal feed and import it into your calendar app, or subscribe to it on your Google Calendar. And then I can have it on my calendar and not have to like click the add to Google Calendar button every time. And so anyway, that's another feature, that having the ability to have access to all of these things that you pass in during a CLI build step is just a superpower that has given me so many cool things to play around with Elm-pages, and more to come in the future. Okay, so another great question. I could talk about that for 2 more hours. Okay, an example of dynamic content in a static page, perhaps an Elm UI rendered page with a text field that updates text on the page as text is entered. Okay, cool. So dynamic content in a static page. Right. So actually the incremental Elm live page is also a pretty good example of that. Like this is dynamic content. This on-air Twitch button is actually fetched in real time, not as a static HTTP request, but it lives side by side with the event listings, which is from static HTTP. So let's see. Well, if we go, like, let's take the elm-pages starter and let's see, where's our model? Let me open this in Intellij. Okay, so let's see, like a text field. So if we, let's see, where's our message type? Okay, so we'd have to change the message, and we kind of did something like this. Dirk is saying in the comments, elm-pages is a static engine. Very cool. Yeah, it's the way I keep thinking about elm-pages is that it's really like a platform. So, you know, just like Elm is a platform, it gives you the ability to hook into certain things. Like if you do browser.application, then the Elm platform allows you to have a certain message whenever the page changes. That's like a platform. So what do you want to do with that? Well, here, I'll give you the URL whenever it changes. And then you can use this URL parser and parse it into your own custom type and then do routing. And so it gives you this like platform. I see elm-pages the same way, that it's a platform, but it gives you certain platform features for building a static site. So like generating files, it's like a platform. What do you do with it? Well, you could do anything with it. You could generate JavaScript files with it and load those JavaScript files on a page. You could, you could do all sorts of crazy things with that. But here's this building block, and the platform is not telling you what to do with it. It's just trying to expose it in a nice and type-safe way. Okay, so now if we wanted to do some dynamic stuff, so elm-pages is just an Elm app, which means that we can add messages. So we could change our message type here, and we could say, so I think I actually need an on page change message. That's just something I happen to know because something's going to complain at me here because I have this on page change, which is just the unit type, which I had as our message type before. Okay, so now that's back to compiling. So like we could have, let's see. In our view for a page, we could just have a text area. So the text area, list of attributes, on-change text placeholder label. On-change got text input. Let's add that message type. So that takes a string. What else do we need? Text placeholder. So the text is actually going to be, let's just make it the model for now since we're not using the model for anything. Oh, text input. We'll start with the empty string. Got to handle this message. Man, the Elm compiler is so helpful, isn't it? model, and we want to say the text input is the new string, and then we want to do command.none. Okay, so now we can get the text. What else do we need here? Missing fields, placeholder, and label. Okay. So let's run this. elm-pages starter. So you can walk through the same steps if you clone the elm-pages starter. Placeholder is a maybe input placeholder. I'll just make it nothing. Okay, so our site is running. elm-pages starter. We've got this input, and actually I can do. I can run this with debug. This is just like a little trick I use. You can do npm. You can do like npm run something or npm start, and then if you do --, then everything that comes after this will be sent in to whatever command this is running under the hood. So I want to run elm-pages develop with a debug flag. So I just did npm start --, and then it passes in --, debug after. So now it's running in debug mode. So we can see when we have messages coming in here. So indeed, we're getting our messages. Cool. And then we can, so let's see. The text is text input. On changes got text input. Oh yeah, I guess we are. If we wanted to, we could just say element.text model.text input. And there we go. So it's just an Elm app. So that's the beauty of it, is you get to decide what to do with that Elm app. The power is yours. It's in your fingertips. You can add stuff to the model. Ryan and I did a live stream last week where we it was quite fun. We kind of went through the elm-pages starter and looked at adding some state to it, and then we compared that to adding state to something using his Elm spa framework, which is really cool. We got a really cool demo of that. I'm definitely thinking about ways to add some similar functionality, or maybe just have a nice story for hooking in Elm Spa to elm-pages. So yeah, that's a cool area to explore. Okay, cool. So elm-pages showcase pulls its data from Airtable. Yeah. To add detailed pages, and by the way, thanks everyone for these are really nice questions. Thanks for posting these. So the elm-pages showcase pulls its data from Airtable. To add detailed pages after parsing page.path, must be placeholder MD files be manually added for every entry. I am sad to say that the answer is currently yes. So what the question is saying is, let's say that we wanted to. So here's the elm-pages showcase. As the question was saying, this is pulling in data from the Airtable API. So it's static HTTP data. So here's the static HTTP response. So it's calling Airtable. It's passing in the authorization token, which is masked here, which is cool, and then it's got this response, and so this is working great, right? It's pulling in the data. Once it's running in the browser, it's decoding that data, and then we can use Elm to display it however we want. Everybody's happy. That's all good. The problem that that Steven's asking about in the question there is, what if I wanted to make a detail page for each of these? So if I wanted to go to elm-pages.com/showcase/incremental elm /syntactic overdrive /elm-pages. So currently, I don't have the ability to do that with Elm-Pages, and it is like the number one thing on my to-do list. And I'm actively working on it right now and exploring it. So what Stephen was saying in his question is, like, is it the case that we currently need to, in order to add a route, so like elm-pages.com/showcase/syntactic overdrive, if we want to add a route for that where you can click to that and go to a detail page, is it true that we need to have a file in the content folder in order to do that? And sadly, the answer right now is yes. The only way to add a route in Elm-Pages right now is by adding a file of the same name to the content folder. So like if we go to the content folder for the Elm-Pages docs site, we've got content/blog/index or static HTTP. Those correspond to the route. So if we go to elmpages.com/blog/static HTTP, there's a route that exactly matches this file path, except with the extension taken out. That's currently how it works. So as a workaround, you can kind of run some sort of script from your static from your data. You'd have to like ping your API, like ping Airtable, get those responses, generate a page for each of them. It's not great. Another alternative is you can use headless CMSs like we did with Netlify CMS, where I went to the admin console, which I set up here with Netlify CMS. So Netlify CMS works really great with Elm-Pages right now because you can add a new docs page and it's going to generate a markdown file and make a pull request for that. That's how Netlify CMS works. It's a Git-based CMS. So it works really well because it will add a pull request that adds a file, and the routing is done with files right now in Elm-Pages. So what I'm working on, and there's an issue here for this, I'm working on decouple routes from the content folder. So here's the issue. So if you're interested in the status of that, keep an eye on this issue. This is my number one priority. And this is the number one thing that I think will make Elm-Pages really like a full-fledged Jamstack tool that you can do anything you could think of really with it. I mean, it's just a matter of like refinements from that point. So like, yeah, I'll give you like a little preview of some ideas I'm working on for this, like behind the scenes here. I'm working on something where you could basically say, like, hey, I want to grab these files from the, so like grab these files from this location, and then for each of those files, and then you generate like a route, and then you parse the metadata, you parse the view, and you could do the same thing with static HTTP data. So at that point, it would be analogous, like Gatsby has this create pages hook. So it would be similar to the create pages API, where you can iterate through these things and then you say create page, you give it a path. In the case of Gatsby, you give it a component. In the case of Elm-Pages, you would give it a decoder. You would decode the data and you would decode it into whatever you're rendering for your views and your metadata. So yeah, that's in progress. That's a very high priority, and I'm really excited to get that functionality because it will open up so many new features. So stay tuned on that. Stephen has another question here. Your screencasts alternate between Tailwind CSS and Elm UI. Is Elm-Pages completely agnostic, or are you erring towards CSS styling approach? And if so, why? Just checking on the chat here. Jack HP95 absolutely wants this is working. I'm switching over to Elm-Pages. Awesome. Yes. I do not blame you. It's that's going to be a game changer, and it will be a fundamentally different. It just opens up a whole new set of things you can build with it. I'm super excited to have that in there. Is Elm-Pages agnostic to CSS or UI tooling, or is there a particular approach that works better? So I guess the answer is kind of both. So Elm-Pages is completely agnostic. So like you've got this view type. So when you look at an Elm-Pages program, not only do you have the model message, but you have your metadata type, which is whatever your metadata decoder decodes into. And then you have this view type, which is whatever your actual markdown or Elm markup or whatever format files render into. So like, for example, here, I'm actually using Dylan Kern's Elm Markdown for this example, for the Elm-Pages documentation site. And whatever type this renders into is my view type. So actually, I'm rendering into not just Elm UI here, but I'm rendering also a table of contents. So I can and which is how I am which is how I'm showing this table of contents in the doc site here. Oops, that might be a bug I need to look into, but interesting. So anyway, it renders into this type. You can render it into any type. You could render it into, I'm rendering it into something that includes like this Elm UI data, but it could just as well be regular HTML. It could be like an Elm CSS sort of element. So is it agnostic to like CSS view tooling, or is there a particular reason why I go back and forth between Elm UI and Tailwind UI? The reason for that is I love Elm UI. There are some fundamental things that make it difficult to build a static site with right now. And that is Elm UI doesn't use media queries at all. So, you know, if you're not familiar with media queries, it just lets you sort of sprinkle in something that will conditionally apply certain CSS on certain like device dimensions and things like that, right? So, so with Tailwind UI, you know, you can do responsive stuff. Like this. It uses these media queries, and you can say this image has width 16, or if it's greater than or equal to the medium media query breakpoint, then make it width 32, or if it's greater than or equal to the large media query breakpoint, then make it this width. And so see how it, wait, am I reading this right? Because it's saying it's the smallest width. I think it starts at the small width of 16 by default, 32 on medium screens, 48 on large screens. That's weird, because like as I make it larger, it gets smaller. I'm not. Oh, is this a different? Yeah, this is a different example. So anyway, you get the idea. It allows you to do responsiveness inline and Tailwind UI, and it will just apply these different attributes, these different utility classes, conditionally based on the media query. So that works really well with static sites, because with a static site, it's pre-rendered. So Elm-Pages sites get pre-rendered. And when you pre-render it, you are you load up that site, and then it hydrates into an Elm app. Since it's hydrating into an Elm app, you want it to look right before it hydrates. So the way that Elm UI does responsiveness, it depends on the application state, because what you do is you can send in with a flag, you can send in the current dimension so it has it on init, and then you can listen for changes to the device dimensions. But that depends on state. I actually I also don't like passing around my device dimensions everywhere, just making it stateful. To me, I'd rather have like a declarative thing where I can just describe in a large device it looks like this, in a small device it looks like this, and not have that depend on state. But also you can avoid the flash that way, because what happens with Elm UI static sites sometimes, thought I lost the stream for a second. So what happens with Elm UI static sites sometimes is you get this flash where the page is pre-rendered on a device with a particular set of dimensions. Then you load it on a mobile device. It displays it with whatever rules you had for rendering it on the device this big. And now somebody loads it with a device this big, and it has a flash once the Elm app takes over and hydrates. So that's one of the reasons I've been using both of them. I think there are a few ways to make it a little nicer. So I actually do something with media queries in the Elm-Pages header. Like if we go to elm-pages.com, like if I just scroll here, so actually if I just refresh, if I hard refresh this page, there's no flash. It displays the proper mobile version of the nav bar immediately. And why is that? It's because I've used this trick where I'm using a media query that I have for a class, where I'll hide the view on a particular size and show another view on a particular size. So I've kind of worked around it in a couple of areas with Elm UI, but I'm also running into a couple of other things that have been tricky for like rendering my markdown into Elm UI, where sometimes things sort of bleed over because of there are some tricky things with the way that Elm UI does like overflow versus wrapping. So there are a couple of things. I've been talking to Matt about it a little bit. There's one known issue that you can't have a paragraph within a paragraph, but there's no reason you shouldn't be able to. And in Elm UI, a paragraph will wrap. So if you put like a paragraph within a list item, and then this kind of top level thing is a paragraph, it doesn't work the way you'd expect it to. But I talked to Matt about it, and he said there's no reason it shouldn't. So that may be something that's improved in the future. But for now, there are a couple of blemishes like that when you try using Elm UI with a static site. And when you try rendering your markdown with Elm UI, or when you try to have responsive design with Elm UI. So that's the reason I go back and forth between the two. Tailwind UI has been a pretty nice experience, but of course, it's tough to beat a lot of the features that Elm UI has too. Okay, so cool. All right, so next question. I love Elm Graph QL, thank you. And how long until we can use Elm Graph QL queries to define dynamic content for Elm-Pages? What API questions, trade-offs are you wrestling with? Okay. Nice. Awesome question. So what this person is asking about is, I believe this person is kind of referring to how tools like Gatsby and GridSum, which are other static site Jamstack tools out there, they allow you to use GraphQL queries to fetch data. So let's look at an example. So like if we go to Gatsby, actually I can probably, let's see, do I have a Gatsby thing in here? Maybe not. I was gonna see if I could go into the Gatsby console live, but I'm too lazy to clone a fresh version of it. I guess it wouldn't be that hard, but the way that Gatsby works, there's this sort of life cycle where in Gatsby you have these like Gatsby node JS files, and in the Gatsby node JS files you sort of put data into this local GraphQL database. I know that GraphQL like isn't a database and stuff, but what I mean by that is like there's like this local data store, and Gatsby exposes this way for you to put data into that data store, and then it gives you a way to make GraphQL queries to fetch that data that you put in using the node scripts, right? So you just run these node scripts, and for example, it'll fetch data from a sanity.io headless CMS, or from Contentful, or these different data sources, or from Airtable. It grabs that data, it creates these nodes in this local database, and then it will, when you make your GraphQL queries, you can fetch that data that you put in there with these different data sources. So that's kind of how Gatsby handles different data sources. So with and I've had some people mention this, and people have said like, you know, like you're the author of Elm Graph QL, you're building this static site framework in Elm. When is it going to use Elm Graph QL, or when is it going to use GraphQL queries to fetch data? Actually, I've definitely thought about this a lot, and my goal is to, so like when I think about what problems is Gatsby solving by using GraphQL to fetch the data, one of the main things it's solving is it's trying to give you some structure to your data. So you can just pull in data, and then like you can define these different data sources. So if we look at like these different Gatsby plugins, you know, you could have like some contentful data or something like that. And it puts this data in, and it gives it some structure to that data. So for one thing, it's a way of having like typed data, and your GraphQL request can like fail if you try to fetch something the wrong way or whatever. But Elm is already a typed language. And so I think we can do better. I think that by taking advantage of the strengths of Elm, we can solve this problem in a simpler way, with fewer layers of indirection, with fewer abstractions, with fewer things to learn, with and I think that with Gatsby, I hear a lot of people say that it's like a real stumbling block to understand this sort of life cycle and how things go into this local database and then they come out of it, and it's like confusing. I think it's also hard to maintain. So with elm-pages, I wanted to solve those problems a different way, and that's kind of what the static HTTP API is. And the static HTTP API is going to be more like a static data API in the future. So I'm going to be working on doing things like, if you want to have optimized images where you can, you know, have images in, you know, with a 600 pixel width and a 400 and a 100, and you can fetch different ones based on the device you're viewing from, right? That's like one of the really cool things about Gatsby is this Gatsby image plugin. I want to allow you to do similar things with elm-pages using the static data API. So the way that the static HTTP API works is you can make these requests. So like here's the showcase page for the elm-pages documentation site. I'm fetching the current star count from GitHub, from the GitHub API. and I'm fetching this showcase data from the Airtable API, and then I've got my decoder, right? So now I've got this statically typed data, and I can optimize that data. I can strip out unused data. So I feel like I can accomplish the same things that Gatsby accomplishes using GraphQL, but without adding that additional concept. You just fetch the data, and then you can decode it. Now, you can even use Elm Graph QL, so which is actually what I do for, like here, why don't I show you? If I go to the Incremental Elm Live page, so the events page, here's an Elm Graph QL query. So I'm using GraphQL to fetch this data from my Sanity GraphQL schema, right? I've got this Sanity GraphQL schema. I've got a live stream which has a title. The Sanity API has like a lot of nulls, which is kind of annoying. But the good news is that if there is a null and it failed, I can use this Elm GraphQL feature of non-null or fail, which will fail the whole decoder if something comes back null. If that happens, it'll happen during my build step because I'm fetching it as a static HTTP request, which means the user will not see that error. I will see that error if I said something will never be null and it turns out to be null, and then I'll handle that, and then I'll ship it, and then the user will see the page with no errors. So, so you can use GraphQL, but you don't need to. With Gatsby, they try to get the advantages of like having typed data and these types of things and having nice structure to your data using GraphQL. And I think they also want to be able to like have these different types of data and merge them together into a nice structure. So you can like separate your kind of definition of all of your data and your structure and how you fetch it from how you consume that data and have them be two different things. I feel like with Elm, we can do it in a simpler way because of Elm's, strengths and because of its type system. And it can solve those same problems in a simpler way that's better suited to Elm. So like, for this question of like, how do you fetch this data and you have this structure for the data, like, okay, so we've got like decoders, we've got HTTP requests for how to fetch the data and all that stuff. So that's what like this events module I have in the Incremental Elm website, which is open source, by the way. That's how this works. It's got this Elm Graph QL selection set, which is a type of decoder. And so it tells us how to decode this. And then I can't remember where I make that request. But wherever I make the request, interesting. Yeah. Wherever I'm making that request, it's I can encapsulate that into an Elm module. I can have this static HTTP data. It's a particular data type. So it's just Elm code. I can encapsulate that however I want. I can have the decoder in one place. I can have the thing that has the details of the HTTP request in another place. It's up to me, right? I can store it however I want. And then if I want to use that same data in different places, I can make this HTTP request here. I can make it in another place. So it's really cool because it's composable, and I can use that same static HTTP data if I wanted to use that for generating some files in one place for, like once I have the ability to programmatically create page routes, I could use it to create page routes and their content. I could use these requests to make like detail pages for each incremental Elm event, for example, right? So I can do all those things, and I can just have the static HTTP value, which represents how to make the HTTP request and how to decode it, and I can use it wherever I want it. So I get that same advantage of Gatsby where I've decoupled how I'm kind of fetching and parsing data into a structure from how I'm using the data. I've done that. I just have the static HTTP type, and I just use it wherever I want to. So all you have to do is structure your code in a nice way where you've encapsulated the details of that static HTTP request in one place. And from the implementation side, elm-pages as a framework can see, oh, you're calling the exact same static HTTP request 10 times. It doesn't matter, because all it does is it says, well, I already made this HTTP request. Here's the data. And it doesn't do that same HTTP request 10 times during the CLI build step. It does it one time. And of course, in the browser, it doesn't make any HTTP requests to fetch that data from the API. It just gets it. It gets it from your, it's just a file, right? It's just a JSON file that it fetches along with your CDN host. So yeah, I feel like you can get a lot of those same benefits that Gatsby gets with GraphQL, but in a simpler way. So that's something I find super, super exciting. I've definitely gotten a lot of inspiration and motivation from how Gatsby does things, but I think like you need to take advantage of the strengths that you're working with. And building a static site tool in Elm, we have a lot of really unique strengths. We have pure functions. So you have a certain input, it's always going to result in the same output. That's a powerful feature that as a framework author, you can really leverage that to give the user powerful tools that are very predictable and very maintainable. And yet you can do incredibly powerful things using that determinism of the functions that they give you. And like if I don't pass you a certain piece of data, then you can't depend on it because you're using pure functions. So we got to leverage Elm's strengths. So cool. These are all awesome questions. Thank you so much for sharing these. So next question, is Webpack key to the magic of Elm-pages, or could you imagine switching to Parcel or an alternative bundler? That's from Steven. Thanks for the question. Okay, so this is a very nice question too. I think that I actually initially built the first version of Elm-pages with Parcel, and I like Parcel a lot. I think that building on Webpack, when I switched to that, turned out to be a really great decision, at least for now, because for one thing, as far as a consumer of Elm-pages, you don't directly interact with it, at least not very much. There are a few places where it kind of gets exposed that it's using Webpack under the hood, but for the most part, it's hidden from you. And there are just so many people using Webpack, right? So the plugins there are so many plugins out there. They're maintained so well, and it gives you so much control. So like if Elm-pages were to use Parcel, what I found was I really like using Parcel as a user if I can get away with it, right? But then if it doesn't do something I need it to do, you're kind of out of luck. I know that Parcel 2 is adding a little more configurability, but it's still a ways out. And even so, the goal of Parcel, if you're not familiar, check out Parcel.js. It's really cool. But it sort of tries to be like a zero configuration bundler. Well, there it is. Zero configuration web application bundler. It's a really great tool. But when I'm building Elm-pages, since the users of Elm-pages don't have to worry about configuring it themselves, I, as the framework author and the contributors to the framework, need to do that. And I apologize to the contributors and to myself for making us go through the complexity of configuring Webpack, because it can be really crazy at times. But it's so powerful. There's such a vibrant ecosystem of things out there, of knowledge of how to do things. You can build your own Webpack plugins, you know. And so it turned out to be a really great fit, because what you want is a very powerful tool that lets you do anything to build a framework on top of, right? Which is what we're doing. We're building a framework, and we want to do whatever we need to be able to do. And then abstract that away from the users. So it turns out Webpack is a really good tool. In the future, could it be something else? Absolutely. But like there are certain tools that elm-pages is using, like it's pre-rendering the pages. So for that, it uses the pre-render spa plugin. These things are all very high up in my commonly used URLs here. So it uses this pre-render spa plugin under the hood, and all I do is I pass it a list of routes, which I'm able to grab by running some Elm code, and then I like I said, I have this like tunnel from your Elm configuration that you give me when you init an Elm-pages application, and I can tunnel that through to my CLI process and run some stuff with Webpack on it. So this is all I do. So it's been a really good fit. It allows a lot of power, can squeeze a lot of performance out of it. So for the foreseeable future, it's been working quite well. But that said, we've abstracted it to a point where I think if there were ever a reason to consider something else, we absolutely could use another tool. Cool. And we've got one more question here. What do you like about Intellij editor in the Brave browser? I've been thinking about making like a, have you guys seen this uses.tech? I've been thinking about making like a little uses profile. They've got these, people just share like a little page on their site of what they use. I think I'll build one of those and just write some of the stuff I use. But yeah, so for Intellij, I'd love to have a conversation with Keith Lazuka. He's a nice guy. I've chatted with him at conferences, but I'd love to hear from him maybe on one of these live streams if he's interested, about like how to extend Intellij Elm. He's done a really nice job with that, and he's like built in the Elm type system into the internals of the tooling. So it exposes some really cool functionality that comes kind of as a package when you build a tool and you teach Intellij about your types and how to infer types. It can do a lot. So there are a lot of cool features, like you can like inspect a type. I can just Control-Shift-P over a type, and it knows that this is a bool, and it knows, it can do all sorts of stuff that really saves me when I'm in the middle of a really complex, piece of code and I don't know what the type is where I am. There are things like that that help me out a lot. I really like the way that it allows me to import something. If I say like something dot, I don't know, what is it? Oh, this isn't valid Elm code. Yeah, if I do something like this, something.filter map, then it says like, oh, filter map, that function exists on list. Do you want me to import list as something? There are a lot of things like that that make it a really nice experience. So I'm kind of an editor connoisseur because I can't make up my mind on which features I want. I want all of them. And I recommend just playing around with them. But Intellij Elm has some really cool features. If you go to their GitHub repo, they kind of go into some of those features, and I recommend just look at the features, click into some of these features, and there are even some demos here, and that's a great way to learn more about it. But maybe I'll do a live stream to dig into that a little bit more. And the Brave browser, for me, it's just there's this whole sharing cookies everywhere, and you go to a page and it has like a Facebook login with Facebook token, and now they're sending some cookies to Facebook about your browsing history when you didn't even like visit Facebook. And there's just all this, like, I think it's nice to have like a little bit of basic internet privacy hygiene. I'm not a huge follower of those things. Like I don't know that much about it, but it just feels like these days it's not a bad idea to have like a little bit of basic hygiene on that stuff. And for me, Brave browser has been great because it gives you a lot of great like basic privacy features at a very low cost, because it's just running Chrome, and you can open up the dev tools and it's just what you're familiar with Chrome, and it's going to render the same way as Chrome because it's using the same WebKit under the hood, and then it's, if you ever need to, you can turn the shields down if a site is behaving badly because you turned off some third-party cookies or something. But for the most part, you don't need to, and so you may as well. So I've been really enjoying that. So cool. I think that's good for one morning. Thanks for everybody joining. This was a lot of fun, and more to come. If you've got ideas on something you'd like to see on a live stream, let me know. I've been kind of focusing on kind of exploring some things in open source and trying to make improvements to open source and give people a window into the process. On Monday, Philip Kruger and I are going to be going through and using Dylan Kern's Elm Markdown to build some Markdown AST validation and transformation plugins to do things like you shouldn't have more than one level 1 heading in your Markdown. So let's validate that and give an error if you do that. Or transforming it, adding a slug so you can have like a heading like a GitHub README would have, and link to those. So Jack HP95, awesome stream. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining. Dirk, thanks for your questions. Thank you for the kind words. Hopefully I'll see you all next time and see you on the interwebs. Have a good day, everybody. Take care.